Why did some 70s movies scare censors more than real-world violence on the evening news? These were not just controversial films. They were court cases, moral panics, political headaches, and nightmares that governments tried to cut, bury, or ban completely. Tonight, we are counting down 12 movies that crossed lines audiences still argue about today. But the final film became so infamous, its director was treated like a criminal. Number 12. A Bay of Blood, 1971. Before the slasher boom had a name, this film was already sharpening the knife. A Bay of Blood, also known as Twitch of the Death Nerve, did not arrive like a polite mystery or a classic Gothic thriller. It came crawling out of Italian horror with a colder, nastier attitude, turning inheritance, greed, and murder into something almost ritualistic. Directed by Mario Bava, the film follows a brutal chain of killings around a valuable bay, where almost every character seems ready to betray, deceive, or destroy someone else for control of the land. What made it so controversial was not just the violence. It was the way the violence felt mechanical, sudden, and shockingly casual. Characters did not die with grand melodrama. They were eliminated with a cruel bluntness that later slasher films would borrow again and again. You can feel its fingerprints on the horror movies that followed, especially the body count structure that became famous in the late 70s and 80s. For censors, this was not harmless Gothic entertainment. It looked like a blueprint for a more graphic future of horror. The film became tied to the video nasty panic, where disturbing titles were blamed for corrupting viewers through home video. Today, A Bay of Blood feels historically important, but also dangerous in a fascinating way. A film that helped invent a monster Hollywood would later pretend it created. Number 11. Straw Dogs, 1971. Some films disturb audiences because of what they show. Straw Dogs disturbed them because of what it forced them to argue about afterward. Released in 1971, Sam Peckinpah's controversial thriller placed violence inside a quiet, rural setting, making the horror feel less like fantasy and more like something waiting behind a locked front door. The story follows an American mathematician who moves with his wife to a remote English village, only for tension, resentment, masculinity, and intimidation to slowly build into a terrifying confrontation. The controversy centered on the film's brutal violence and especially its notorious assault sequence, which became one of the most debated scenes in 70s cinema. Critics, censors, and viewers argued over whether the film was exposing male violence or exploiting it. That uncomfortable question helped keep Straw Dogs trapped in controversy for years, especially in the United Kingdom, where its home video availability became heavily restricted during the video censorship era. What makes the film so powerful is its slow pressure. It does not begin as a blood-soaked nightmare. It begins with glances, insults, silence, and unease. Then it turns into a savage study of how civilized people can become frightening when pushed past control. Straw Dogs still feels dangerous because it does not give viewers an easy moral exit. It makes violence look ugly, intimate, and disturbingly human, and that is exactly why censors could not leave it alone. Number 10. The Devils, 1971. This was not just a banned film. It was a cinematic grenade thrown at religion, politics, power, and censorship itself. Ken Russell's The Devils, released in 1971, remains one of the most infamous British films ever made. Set in 17th century France, it tells the story of Father Urbain Grandier, a priest caught in a storm of religious hysteria, political manipulation, sexual repression, and public punishment. But Russell did not present this story quietly. He turned it into a fever dream of madness, cruelty, desire, and institutional corruption. The controversy exploded because the film attacked sacred authority with shocking visual force. Its images of possessed nuns, torture, blasphemous spectacle, and religious hypocrisy were considered too extreme for mainstream audiences. Censors demanded cuts, and several versions circulated with missing or altered material. For decades, The Devils became one of those films people whispered about more than actually saw, because its full power was repeatedly softened, buried, or kept out of easy reach. But beneath the outrage, the film had a sharp political message. It was not simply trying to shock, it was asking what happens when religious fear becomes a weapon for the state and when public morality is used to destroy inconvenient people. That is why The Devil still feels explosive. It is not controversial because it is messy. It is controversial because it knew exactly where to strike. Number 9, A Clockwork Orange, 1971. A movie about free will became so dangerous that its own director helped remove it from public reach. A Clockwork Orange, released in 1971, did not just shock audiences with violence, it shocked them with style. Stanley Kubrick built a futuristic nightmare where brutality looked clean, colorful, and almost theatrical, following Alex DeLarge, a young criminal whose love of classical music, cruelty, and control turns him into one of cinema's most disturbing anti-heroes. The controversy came from the film's cold, unnerving mixture of crime, psychology, and punishment. Viewers were not simply watching violence, they were being forced to ask whether society had the right to destroy a person's free will in order to make him good. That question should have made the film a serious moral debate. Instead, the public conversation became dominated by fear. Reports of copycat incidents, public outrage, and tabloid panic surrounded the movie, especially in Britain. Then came the decision that made its legend even bigger. Kubrick requested that the film be withdrawn from circulation in the United Kingdom, creating a de facto ban that lasted for decades. That made A Clockwork Orange feel less like a movie and more like forbidden evidence. Its power comes from how uncomfortable it remains. The film never lets the viewer relax into easy judgment. Alex is monstrous, the system is monstrous, and the audience is left trapped between them. That is why censors feared it. A Clockwork Orange did not just show violence. It made people question who gets to control the human mind. Number 8, Last Tango in Paris, 1972. Some scandals fade with time, but this one only became more disturbing the longer people looked at it. Last Tango in Paris, released in 1972, was promoted as an intense adult drama about grief, desire, power, and emotional collapse. Directed by Bernardo Bertolucci and starring Marlon Brando and Maria Schneider, the film followed a broken middle-aged man and a young woman entering a secret, anonymous relationship in a nearly empty Paris apartment. At the time, the film was treated like a cultural explosion. Some critics called it daring, others called it obscene. Censors saw it as a direct challenge to public decency, and in Italy, the backlash became extreme enough that the film was banned, legal action followed, and copies were reportedly ordered destroyed. In several places, the movie's explicit sexual content and emotional intensity made it nearly impossible to discuss without moral outrage taking over. But the controversy did not end in the 70s. Years later, public understanding of the film changed even more because of the way Maria Schneider spoke about her experience during one of the movie's most infamous scenes. That shifted the conversation from censorship and obscenity to consent, exploitation, and the power imbalance between directors, stars, and young performers. That is why Last Tango in Paris still feels radioactive. It is not just controversial because of what appears on screen. It is controversial because the story behind the camera became almost as unsettling as the story in front of it. Number 7, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. The title promised blood, but the real terror was how little comfort the movie allowed the audience to feel. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, released in 1974, looked like something dragged out of a nightmare rather than produced by a normal film crew. Directed by Tobe Hooper, it followed a group of young people who stumble into a remote Texas nightmare ruled by a grotesque family and one of horror's most unforgettable figures, Leatherface. The strange part is that the film is often remembered as far gorier than it actually is. Its violence is brutal, yes, but much of the horror comes from atmosphere, the heat, the screaming, the buzzing sound of machinery, the rotten farmhouse, and the feeling that nobody is coming to help. It feels dirty, sweaty, and real in a way that deeply unsettled audiences and censors. That realism became the problem. In multiple countries, the film faced bans, cuts, or serious restrictions because authorities believed its tone was too savage and psychologically damaging. It did not feel like polished studio horror. It felt like something discovered, something illegal, something that should not have been filmed. Its cultural impact was enormous. It helped reshape horror by proving that terror did not need castles, ghosts, or elegant monsters. It could happen in daylight, on a rural road, with ordinary people trapped in a nightmare. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre remains frightening because it never feels safe. Even today, it does not simply entertain. It corners the viewer and refuses to open the door. Number 6. Snuff, 1975. Few films built their reputation on a rumor as ugly, manipulative, and dangerous as this one. Snuff, released in 1975, became infamous not because it was a polished masterpiece, but because it was marketed with the suggestion that audiences might be watching something real. The film itself began as a low-budget exploitation project, but its later promotion turned it into a cultural lightning rod by leaning into the horrifying idea of snuff cinema, footage where actual murder was supposedly captured for entertainment. That marketing choice changed everything. Instead of being dismissed as cheap exploitation, snuff became part of a wider panic about whether underground films, pornography, violence, and criminal rumors were merging into something truly dangerous. Audiences were not just asking whether the movie was offensive, they were asking whether the final shocking sequence was real. That uncertainty gave the film a sinister power it probably never would have earned on its own. Censors and moral campaigners responded exactly as the distributors likely hoped, with outrage. The controversy became the advertisement. The more people condemned it, the more forbidden it seemed. During later censorship battles and the video nasty climate, snuff became one of those titles people discussed like contraband. What makes it so disturbing in film history is not artistic greatness. It is the way it exposed a dark truth about exploitation marketing. Sometimes the scandal is the product. Snuff did not just cross a line. It sold the idea that the line might not exist anymore. Number 5. Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom, 1975. This is the film people mention when they want to prove cinema can become almost unbearable. Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom, released in 1975, was Pier Paolo Pasolini's final film, and it remains one of the most banned, condemned, and debated movies ever made. On the surface, it is a story about powerful fascist figures imprisoning young people and subjecting them to humiliation, control, and cruelty. But underneath that horror, Pasolini was making a furious political statement about power, corruption, consumerism, and the way human beings can be reduced to objects. That did not make the film easier for censors to accept. Its images were considered so extreme that many countries banned it outright or allowed it only in cut form. The film's reputation became almost mythic. The movie people warned others not to watch, the title that appeared on lists of forbidden cinema, the work that even serious film lovers approached with hesitation. The controversy also became darker because Pasolini was murdered shortly before the film's release, adding an eerie shadow to its legacy. Suddenly, Salo was not only an extreme political allegory. It felt like the final statement of an artist who had pushed cinema into its most hostile territory. What makes Salo so difficult is that it refuses entertainment. It does not offer comfort, glamour, or release. It weaponizes disgust to attack systems of domination. That is why it was banned, and why, decades later, it still feels like cinema's most punishing accusation. Number 4. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. Some films become controversial because they shock audiences. This one became controversial because people could not agree whether it was revenge cinema, exploitation, or both. I Spit on Your Grave, originally released as Day of the Woman in 1978, followed a writer who is violently attacked and later seeks revenge against the men responsible. From the beginning, the film was not treated like ordinary horror. It was treated like a public argument waiting to happen. The backlash centered on the film's long, disturbing assault sequence and its blunt revenge structure. Many critics condemned it as cruel, excessive, and exploitative, while defenders argued that its second half gave the victim a form of brutal agency rarely seen in mainstream thrillers of that time. But censors did not care about academic debate. In several countries, the film faced bans, cuts, or heavy restrictions because its content was considered too graphic and emotionally punishing for public release. What makes its legacy so complicated is that the film does not allow a simple reaction. It is ugly, confrontational, and often difficult to discuss without strong emotion. Yet that very discomfort is why it stayed in the censorship conversation for decades. I Spit on Your Grave remains one of the most divisive titles in 70s exploitation history. It did not merely cross a line. It forced audiences to ask whether some revenge stories become dangerous when the horror feels too real. Number 3. The Driller Killer, 1979. A cheap horror film became a national villain because its title, cover art, and timing were almost perfectly designed to terrify moral campaigners. The Driller Killer, released in 1979, was Abel Ferrara's grimy, low-budget story of an unstable New York artist spiraling into violence. On paper, it was a rough, urban horror film about madness, poverty, creative pressure, and collapse. But in the public imagination, it became something far more dangerous. The film's notoriety exploded during the British video nasty panic when home video suddenly made violent films easier to rent, replay, and watch outside traditional cinema controls. The Driller Killer became a perfect target. Its name sounded brutal, its promotional imagery looked deliberately provocative, and its raw, dirty atmosphere made it feel like the kind of movie newspapers could point to as proof that horror was corrupting society. The irony is that the film's reputation often became bigger than the film itself. Many people who condemned it had not carefully studied its themes or its underground New York setting. They reacted to the idea of it: a drill, a killer, a cassette box, and a moral panic waiting to ignite. That is why The Driller Killer matters. It shows how censorship is not always about content alone. Sometimes a movie becomes dangerous because of the cultural fear surrounding it. This was not just a horror film. It was a symbol that censors could hold up and say, "This is what must be stopped." Number 2. Monty Python's Life of Brian, 1979. The strangest thing about this ban is that the movie was a comedy, and that made some people even angrier. Monty Python's Life of Brian, released in 1979, followed Brian Cohen, an ordinary man born near the same time and place as Jesus, who is repeatedly mistaken for a religious figure. The film was not attacking faith in a simple way. Its real target was blind obedience, political confusion, mob thinking, and the human habit of turning almost anything into dogma. But many religious groups saw it differently. Before and after release, the film was accused of blasphemy, disrespect, and mockery of sacred history. The outrage became so intense that it was banned or restricted in several places, including parts of the United Kingdom and Ireland. In some towns, local authorities refused to screen it, creating the strange situation where a comedy became one of the most forbidden films of its time. That controversy only made the film more famous. The more officials tried to keep audiences away, the more curious people became. Viewers wanted to know what joke could possibly be so dangerous that councils, campaigners, and religious leaders wanted it buried. Today, Life of Brian is widely regarded as one of the greatest comedies ever made, but its censorship history reveals something sharper than laughter. Comedy can threaten authority because it makes people question what they are told to respect. And once people start laughing at power, power often panics first. Number 1. Cannibal Holocaust, 1979. No 70s film turned censorship into a criminal mystery quite like this one. Cannibal Holocaust, released in 1979, did not simply disgust audiences, it convinced some people that what they were watching might be real. Directed by Ruggero Deodato, the film used a fake documentary structure years before found-footage horror became mainstream, telling the story of a missing film crew whose recovered footage reveals cruelty, exploitation, and escalating violence in the Amazon. The controversy was immediate and massive. Its graphic violence, real animal killings, and staged human brutality pushed the film into a category few movies ever reach. In Italy, Deodato was reportedly arrested and forced to prove that the actors were alive because rumors spread that the deaths on screen were real. That single fact turned the film from a notorious exploitation title into a legend of banned cinema. Around the world, Cannibal Holocaust faced bans, cuts, prosecutions, and condemnation, but what makes it more disturbing is that it was not only about cannibal tribes. despite the title. The film also accused media makers of turning suffering into entertainment. In other words, it was condemning exploitation while being deeply exploitative itself. That contradiction is why it remains so infamous. Cannibal Holocaust is ugly, manipulative, and historically important all at once. It became number one because it did more than shock censors. It made them wonder whether cinema had finally gone too far. These films were not just banned because they were violent, offensive, or shocking. They were banned because they made people afraid of what cinema could make audiences feel, question, or believe. Some became masterpieces, some became warnings, some still feel dangerous today. Which one do you think deserved the controversy, and which one was punished too harshly?